Welcome to Crime Era Channel, where every crime tells a story. The darkest secrets of crime are uncovered, and the hidden truths of criminal underworlds come to light.
The jungle is quiet now. The leaves hang heavy, unmoving, as if the air itself is holding its breath. But in the late 1970s, this place, Guyana's remote northwest interior, pulsed with a different kind of energy. A community built from nothing, a promise forged from desperation, and at the center of it all, a man whose voice once sounded like salvation. This is where the story ends, but it does not begin here. To understand Jonestown's darkest hour, the moment nearly 1,000 men, women, and children lost their lives in one afternoon, we have to start decades earlier, in the American Midwest, before the poison, before the armed guards, before the final recording known as the death tape. We begin with a young pastor named Jim Jones, a man who understood something about human nature long before the world realized how dangerous that knowledge could be. Jones grew up on the fringes of society, poor, isolated, and hungry for purpose. His childhood was marked by loneliness so profound it shaped his obsession with belonging. Some say he found refuge in the church. Others say he found power there. What's certain is that he learned very early that a charismatic voice could fill pews and fill the void inside him. By the 1950s, he was preaching not just about God, but about justice, equality, and radical inclusion, messages that resonated across racial and class lines at a time when America was still deeply divided. He built a following the way others build empires, brick by brick, sermon by sermon, promise by promise. This gathering of believers became the People's Temple, a movement that felt revolutionary, righteous, and lovingly defiant. For many, Jones did not appear as a future cult leader. He appeared as a savior of the marginalized. But charisma is a double-edged blade, and every savior narrative has a shadow. Behind the scenes, Jones was already testing the boundaries of control, blending faith with fear, loyalty with surveillance, spirituality with manipulation. And the more followers he gained, the more he demanded. They believed they were building a better world. He believed he was the only one who could lead them there. Over time, his sermons shifted from hopeful to apocalyptic. America, he warned, was collapsing, morally, politically, spiritually. And when the world eventually turned against them, he alone could offer safety. The stage was set, the seeds were planted, and the road to Jonestown had quietly begun. From a single voice in a small Indiana church to one of the deadliest episodes in modern history. This is the beginning of the descent.
Before the world knew the name Jonestown, before Guyana, before the tragedy that would make headlines across the globe, there was the promise of something extraordinary, something transformative, something that felt, to its earliest members, like a revolution wrapped in the language of faith. The People's Temple began not as a cult, but as a beacon. In the 1960s, America was a nation wrestling with civil rights, poverty, and political division. Churches preached salvation, but very few practiced equality. Jim Jones stepped into that vacuum with a message that struck like lightning. His sermons defied the norms of his time. Interracial worship, social welfare programs, free meals, clothing drives, elderly care, addiction support. The temple didn't just talk about helping the poor, it actually did. And that was the hook. People didn't join because they were brainwashed. They joined because Jones offered what the world denied them: dignity, belonging, purpose. He fed the hungry, he housed the homeless, he welcomed those rejected everywhere else. To many, he wasn't a preacher, he was a lifeline. But with every new service, every applause-filled sermon, every bus packed for temple road trips, something else was forming behind the curtain: a system of control. Jones understood that loyalty grew stronger when people felt indebted. He also understood that the most faithful followers were those who felt they owed him everything. Members began surrendering their time, their labor, their money. Some even signed over homes, custody of children, or retirement checks, all in the name of the collective good. Jones framed sacrifice as proof of devotion. He framed obedience as proof of love. And slowly, the People's Temple became less of a church and more of an institution with its own rules, its own culture, and its own reality. Dissent wasn't punished outright. It was softened through guilt, public confessions, and emotional manipulation. A new vocabulary emerged: healing, loyalty, unity, the cause. Each phrase held layers that only temple members understood. The more they participated, the more isolated they became from anyone who questioned Jones's growing power. By the early 1970s, the temple had reached California, a much larger stage for a man hungry for influence. Jones entered politics, forged alliances with city leaders, and packed auditoriums with thousands of cheering followers. Publicly, he was a civil rights hero. Privately, he was tightening his grip. He began experimenting with paranoia, testing how far fear could push devotion. He spoke of enemies, conspiracies, government plots against their movement. He told his followers that the outside world wanted to destroy everything they had built. And slowly, the People's Temple became an island, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, cut off from the world beyond its own borders. A community rising in power, led by a man already descending into shadows.
Before Jonestown was even imagined, the transformation of Jim Jones, from idealistic pastor to self-anointed savior, had already begun. It didn't happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, wrapped in charisma, reinforced by loyalty, and fueled by a growing hunger for absolute control. In California, Jones discovered something intoxicating: power on a public stage. Politicians courted him, journalists praised him, thousands attended his rallies. The People's Temple's humanitarian work became his shield, a reason no one dared to look too closely at the man orchestrating it all. And behind the applause, Jones crafted a new identity. He stopped being just a preacher. He became a healer, a prophet, eventually a messiah. Temple services evolved into something theatrical. Members fainted, screamed, wept, convinced Jones possessed supernatural abilities. He staged miracle healings, manipulated medical information, and used loyal insiders to plant testimonies in the crowd. Everything served one purpose: to elevate Jones beyond criticism. Because once a leader becomes divine, questioning them becomes a sin. But while his public image soared, Jones's private world turned darker. He became obsessed with control, demanding absolute loyalty and access to every part of his followers' lives. He read their letters, dictated their relationships, controlled their finances, and cultivated a culture of confession where the most personal secrets were surrendered to him. Those confessions would later serve as weapons. Inside the temple, doubt was branded as betrayal. Questioning Jones meant risking humiliation, punishment, or being labeled an enemy of the movement. Members were encouraged to report on one another, spouses on spouses, children on parents. The community became a web of surveillance, cloaked as protecting the cause. At the same time, Jones's paranoia grew sharper. He claimed the FBI, CIA, and political extremists were plotting to destroy the People's Temple. He warned that racist mobs wanted to kill them. He painted the world outside the temple as violent, hateful, and hopeless, a place where his followers would be persecuted or abandoned. Only he could protect them. Only he could lead them to safety. And when paranoia becomes prophecy, the next step is isolation. Jones began searching for a physical refuge, a place where the temple could exist entirely under his control, free from government scrutiny, media investigation, and defectors speaking out. A place where his authority could be total. He found it in a remote stretch of jungle in Guyana, a place he promised would be a utopia, a socialist heaven, a sanctuary from the world. But in reality, it was the beginning of the final act, the stage on which his paranoia, control, and messianic delusion would merge into something catastrophic. Great, I'll continue with the next chapter. Before I generate chapter 4, I want to clarify something important. You previously uploaded a file, and the system is asking me to reference it. But for this Jonestown script, I don't need to use any file, unless you want me to. So I'll continue the documentary script normally. The idea of Jonestown did not begin as a prison. It began as a promise. Jim Jones presented Guyana as a socialist Eden, a lush, untouched land where his followers could build the world that America had denied them. A world without racism, poverty, violence, or inequality. A world where the People's Temple could thrive without surveillance, lawsuits, defectors, or journalists undermining the cause. It was escape. It was reinvention. It was liberation, or so they were told. For many temple members, the idea was electrifying. They imagined schools where every child was valued, farms that fed the community, and a society built on cooperation, not competition. Hundreds volunteered to leave behind their homes, their jobs, even their families, believing they were stepping into history. But while they prepared for paradise, Jones prepared for isolation. He had already sensed the walls closing in back in California. Investigative reporters were uncovering fraud, abuse, staged healings, and violence inside the temple. Former members were speaking out, court cases were building, and Jones's drug use and mental instability were worsening. Jonestown was not just a dream, it was an escape route. The first settlers arrived in 1974, idealists armed with tools, seeds, and unwavering faith. The land was wild and unforgiving. Thick jungle, stifling heat, swarms of insects, and soil that resisted their efforts. But they worked from dawn to dusk, carving homes from the forest, building dorms, planter boxes, water lines, and gathering spaces with unwavering determination. Their letters home were filled with excitement. Their photographs were filled with smiles. In those early days, Jonestown looked like a miracle in progress. When Jones visited the settlement for the first time, he saw something different. He didn't see a village, he saw a fortress. A place far enough from the United States that no one could touch him. A place where his voice would be the only voice, and his truth the only truth. By 1977, as scrutiny intensified in America, he ordered hundreds more temple members to move to Guyana immediately. Buses were filled, passports were collected, families were separated in the rush. And when they arrived, they found a reality far harsher than the photos had shown. The soil still refused to yield. The supplies were limited. The labor was backbreaking. And Jones's presence, amplified by medication, paranoia, and exhaustion, darkened everything. Yet they believed. They had come too far to turn back. In the eyes of many followers, the jungle was not exile. It was destiny. And destiny is hard to abandon, even when it begins to feel like captivity. Thanks, but I want to clarify one thing. For this Jonestown documentary script, I do not need to use the uploaded file unless you specifically want me to reference it. The system showed me a note about an uploaded file, but since you didn't request anything involving that file, I will continue the script normally.
When the final waves of People's Temple members arrived in Guyana, many expected the vibrant utopia shown in newsletters and photographs. What they found instead was a settlement pushed to its limits, a fragile village struggling against the weight of Jones's ambition. The jungle was relentless. The humidity wrapped around everything. Tools rusted overnight. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Food production lagged far behind the population's needs. Yet every newcomer was told the same thing: work harder. The dream depends on you. Days began before sunrise with the crackling voice of Jim Jones echoing through loudspeakers. He spoke of revolution, enemies, conspiracies, and the urgent need for sacrifice. It was a steady drumbeat designed to wear down resistance, replacing independent thought with collective obedience. But behind the slogans and singing, Jonestown's reality hardened. The labor was unending. Hours stretched from dawn to dusk, clearing brush, carrying water, tending gardens, repairing buildings, cooking for hundreds. Exhaustion became a constant companion. Medical care was limited, and illness spread quickly in the cramped humidity. The food was scarce. Despite heroic efforts by the agricultural teams, the soil fought back. Meals were often thin soups, rice, and small portions of vegetables. Protein was rare. Weight loss was common. Hunger softened the mind, making compliance easier. Surveillance grew thicker. Jones established patrols, security teams, and a network of informants. No conversation was private. No complaint went unheard. Families whispered in the dark, afraid that even a sigh of frustration might be reported. Punishments escalated. Those who resisted were humiliated during public meetings where accusations were shouted, apologies forced, and loyalty tested. Some were assigned to harsh labor. Others were drugged. A few were confined to an underground box called the Briggs, a punishment that symbolized how far the dream had decayed. And all the while, Jones's health spiraled. He spent long hours in a pavilion chair, sweating, trembling, fueled by a dangerous mixture of amphetamines and barbiturates. His voice, once passionate and persuasive, became slurred and paranoid. He spoke of enemies closing in, of CIA assassins, of conspiracies waiting to strike. To keep followers loyal, he created a world where danger existed everywhere except inside Jonestown. He portrayed the outside as a racist, violent society where temple members would be imprisoned, killed, or torn apart from their children. Fear became the currency of control. By now, the dream of utopia had faded. Jonestown was no longer a sanctuary. It was a closed world run by exhaustion, surveillance, hunger, and a leader who believed his own unraveling mind was divine guidance. What had begun as a refuge was quietly turning into a trap. And for many, the realization came too late. Okay, I understand, but for this Jonestown documentary script, I do not need to use the uploaded file unless you explicitly want me to. Since you haven't requested anything involving that file, I will continue normally. Here's the next chapter, as requested.
Even in the depths of the Guyanese jungle, surrounded by trees, heat, isolation, and the constant hum of insects, doubt has a way of finding cracks to slip through. In Jonestown, those cracks were small at first. A whispered question, a tired complaint, a glance filled with worry. But over time, they widened. The first signs came from the people who worked closest to Jim Jones. They saw the tremors in his hands, the glassy sheen in his eyes, the way he slurred through late-night monologues broadcast across the settlement. They knew he was using amphetamines to stay awake and barbiturates to force himself to sleep. They saw the decline, physical, emotional, psychological, that most members tried desperately to ignore. Others noticed the children. They were hungry, exhausted, and growing thinner by the month. Their schooling was limited, their free time nearly non-existent. They marched, worked, chanted, and recited revolution slogans more often than they played. Parents whispered at night that Jonestown didn't feel like a community anymore. It felt like a place where childhood was sacrificed to ideology. Then came the stories from the defectors, the brave few who risked everything to escape. Some fled through the jungle, some slipped away during supply trips. Some wrote letters home begging for help. Their accounts, filled with descriptions of beatings, humiliation, starvation, and involuntary confinement, began reaching journalists and government officials in the United States. These testimonies sparked a fire Jones couldn't extinguish. He responded by tightening his grip further. Anyone who spoke of leaving was treated as a traitor. Anyone with family in the US was accused of being influenced by capitalist propaganda. Anyone who questioned the food shortages, the punishments, or the non-stop labor was told they were endangering the revolution. And paranoia became policy. Guards patrolled the settlement. Curfews were enforced. Loudspeakers played Jones's voice day and night, weaving warnings of enemies and conspiracies. Letters were censored. Communications were controlled. The outside world became a threat so monstrous that even dreaming of escape felt dangerous. But humans cannot survive indefinitely under suffocating control. And Jonestown, despite the speeches and slogans, was still filled with people who loved their children, missed their families, or simply craved honesty after years of fear. Late at night, in quiet corners of the dormitories, they whispered truths they couldn't say aloud. This wasn't the dream.
"We made a mistake. We have to get out." These murmurs echoed through the settlement like tremors before an earthquake, subtle at first, but undeniable. And those tremors were about to bring outsiders directly into Jonestown, setting in motion the chain of events that would define its fate forever. Thanks, but just to be completely clear, for this Jonestown documentary script, you haven't asked me to use the uploaded file, and there's no reason to use it for writing the next chapter. So I'll continue the narrative normally.
By late 1978, the whispers from Jonestown had grown too loud for the United States to ignore. Families begged for answers. Journalists collected testimonies from defectors. Government officials reviewed alarming letters describing abuse, starvation, and imprisonment. All of it led to one man, a congressman unafraid to challenge powerful institutions, Leo Ryan. Ryan had made a career out of confronting injustice head-on. He once lived undercover as a prisoner to investigate conditions inside California's jails. So when families of People's Temple members pleaded for help, Ryan didn't write reports or hold hearings. He flew to Guyana. As his delegation arrived in the small coastal capital of Georgetown, tensions flared instantly. Temple representatives tried to delay the visit. They insisted everything was fine, that Jonestown was thriving, that Ryan was being misled by bitter defectors. But their resistance only made him more determined. After 2 days of negotiation, Ryan secured permission to visit the settlement. When his small group stepped off the truck inside Jonestown, cameras rolling and journalists taking notes, the residents greeted them with orchestrated smiles and rehearsed enthusiasm. Children sang, adults clapped. Jones himself sat on a wooden throne-like chair, wearing dark sunglasses, radiating both charm and agitation. It was a performance, but not a convincing one. The tension hung too heavily in the air. Guards watched every movement. Residents looked exhausted, malnourished, hollow-eyed. And behind the forced smiles, some faces flickered with desperation. Ryan spoke with families, asked questions, toured buildings, and watched carefully. He had spent his life reading people, and what he saw didn't match the temple's polished claims. Then, quietly, the cracks widened. A note slipped into a journalist's hand, a whispered plea during a handshake, a trembling voice saying, "I want to leave." By nightfall, several Jonestown residents gathered the courage to publicly declare they wanted out, even in front of Jones. The spell was breaking, the illusion was cracking, and Jones felt it. He watched each defector with simmering fury, his composure slipping. Sweat beaded his forehead, his voice became strained, his posture tightened. The one thing he feared more than government investigation was desertion, public, undeniable rejection of his authority. As the defectors prepared to leave with Ryan's delegation, the atmosphere thickened with dread. Residents whispered warnings, some cried, some begged the congressman to hurry. It was clear to everyone. The moment Leo Ryan stepped into Jonestown, the countdown began. Because exposing the truth meant Jones faced consequences he could not control. And leaders who demand absolute devotion do not tolerate being challenged or being abandoned.
When Congressman Leo Ryan prepared to leave Jonestown with the defectors, a strange stillness swept over the settlement. For a moment, the rehearsed smiles were gone. The chanting had stopped. Even the loudspeakers, usually filled with Jim Jones's voice, had fallen silent. Everyone felt the shift. Leaving Jonestown wasn't just an act of rebellion. In Jones's worldview, it was treason, a public declaration that his dream had failed. And as the defectors packed their belongings and moved toward the trucks, Jones watched with a face that revealed everything: fury, humiliation, and a dawning realization that the world would now know the truth. The convoy began the muddy drive out of the jungle toward the small, rough airstrip at Port Kaituma. Rain clouds gathered overhead, thick and heavy, as if mirroring the tension of the people inside the trucks. Ryan's delegation, the journalists, the defectors, all of them sensed that something was wrong. But no one expected the violence waiting for them. At the airstrip, 2 small planes stood on the dirt field, engines idle, wings trembling in the wind. As the defectors began boarding, nervousness spread. Some turned back toward the tree line, as if expecting figures to emerge from the jungle. And then they saw it. A tractor with a large flatbed trailer rolling down the dirt road, loaded with armed men from Jonestown's security force, the Red Brigade. They weren't coming to talk. They jumped off the trailer, rifles raised, faces cold with purpose. The journalists shouted warnings. The defectors screamed. The delegations scattered for cover. Congressman Ryan, determined to protect the people fleeing with him, refused to run. Gunfire erupted. The crack of rifles echoed across the clearing as bullets tore through the airstrip. A cameraman's equipment caught the first seconds of the attack before he fell. Ryan was hit multiple times while shielding terrified defectors behind a wheel well. Members of the NBC crew collapsed. Others scrambled under the planes, trembling, bleeding, praying. The ambush lasted only minutes, but it changed everything. When the shooting finally stopped, the Red Brigade withdrew, leaving devastation behind. 5 people lay dead on the airstrip, including Congressman Leo Ryan, the first U.S. congressman ever assassinated in the line of duty. The survivors were wounded, shocked, huddled in the dirt. They knew what the attack meant. The world would come for Jonestown now. There was no going back. And far inside the jungle, Jim Jones knew it too. The moment his gunmen opened fire, the clock began ticking. The consequences he had spent years fearing were finally at his doorstep. In Jonestown, he gathered his followers for one final meeting. And the path he chose next would plunge the world into a tragedy without parallel. I see the system note about an uploaded file, but for this Jonestown documentary script, you have not asked me to use that file, and there is no reason to use it. So I will continue the narrative normally without referencing or using the file.
When news reached Jonestown that the ambush at Port Kaituma had succeeded, that Congressman Leo Ryan was dead and others wounded, a wave of panic rippled through the settlement. Some froze, some wept, some prayed, but most looked to the pavilion, where Jim Jones had summoned them with urgent instructions. It was the last time the community would ever gather. Jones, slumped in his chair, voice trembling with agitation, told his followers that the outside world would never forgive them. American forces, he claimed, were already on their way. They would torture the children, imprison the adults, destroy everything they had built. He painted a future so bleak, so terrifying, that death seemed merciful by comparison. Fear had always been the engine of his control, but tonight, it became the script for a catastrophe. Jones called it an act of revolutionary suicide. But many who lived through those final minutes knew it was something else. As vats of cyanide-laced Flavor Aid were carried into the pavilion, mothers clutched their children, sobbing. Some asked if there was another way. Others begged Jones to reconsider. A few attempted to walk away, only to be surrounded by armed guards who had long ago sworn loyalty to him. The loudspeakers crackled with Jones's voice, urging calm, urging obedience, urging what he called a peaceful end. But there was nothing peaceful about the scene unfolding beneath the open rafters. Infants were the first victims, poisoned by their parents who believed they had no choice. Then toddlers, teenagers, adults. Some walked forward willingly, convinced by years of indoctrination that this was salvation. Others resisted, crying out as they were forced to drink or injected by those enforcing Jones's final decree. Witnesses described screams, chaos, confusion, a horrific contrast to the serene utopia they had once dreamed Jonestown would be. Jones remained on the platform throughout, voice slowing, slurring, hollowing. He blamed enemies, he blamed the government, he blamed defectors, but he never blamed himself. As the settlement went quiet, hundreds of bodies lying motionless across the pavilion floor, the jungle breeze brushing through the trees, he retreated into his cabin. Minutes later, a single gunshot ended his life. When Guyanese soldiers arrived the next day, they found a silence so heavy it seemed unnatural. Over 900 people lay dead, the largest loss of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster before September 11.
And as investigators walked through the remains, one question echoed louder than all others. Was this suicide, or was it murder? In the end, Jonestown was not a single choice. It was thousands of choices, shaped by fear, control, hope, and despair, all converging in one tragic final hour.
When the world first learned of Jonestown, confusion eclipsed comprehension. Early headlines labeled it a mass suicide, a phrase that felt too simple, too sanitized, too detached from the horror discovered in the Guyanese jungle. As investigators, diplomats, and journalists arrived on site, the magnitude of the tragedy emerged with devastating clarity. Row upon row of bodies lay in the pavilion and across the surrounding fields. Entire families, generations, children who never had a chance to choose. The air was still, heavy with chemicals, grief, and disbelief. Soldiers who stepped into the settlement later admitted they had never seen anything like it and hoped they never would again. The world demanded answers. But the truth was tangled in a web of ideology, coercion, deception, and fear. Survivors, those who escaped into the jungle, hid through the night, or were away on errands during the final hour, struggled to explain what had happened. Some still spoke with affection for the utopian dream they once believed in. Others described the settlement as a prison long before its final day. Many wept for the friends and relatives they could not save. And in the United States, grief turned to anger as families received the news. They wanted accountability, they wanted clarity. But unraveling the truth of Jonestown meant confronting uncomfortable realities about power, manipulation, and the human desire to belong. Investigators quickly determined that the event wasn't the simple narrative of voluntary mass suicide some imagined. Evidence showed people were coerced, restrained, injected. Armed guards prevented escape. Children had no agency at all. Many adults did not either. The question, was it suicide or murder, became a societal debate, one that still echoes decades later. In many respects, it was both, a massacre orchestrated through psychological domination under the guise of ideological purity. The world sought lessons in the wreckage. Experts studied how charismatic leaders exploit vulnerability, how isolation magnifies control, how fear can override reason, and how ordinary people, mothers, teachers, activists, idealists, could be drawn into a movement that ultimately destroyed them. Jonestown forced governments, religious institutions, and mental health professionals to rethink how they identify and intervene in destructive groups. It reshaped public understanding of cult dynamics. It altered the vocabulary of tragedy. But its most enduring lesson is simpler and far more haunting. No one joins a cult. People join a community that slowly becomes one. Jonestown remains a symbol, not of blind devotion, but of how hope can be weaponized, how charisma can become control, and how a dream can turn into a nightmare when one man's voice becomes louder than all others. And long after the jungle reclaimed the land, the echoes of that final night still linger, reminding the world that the boundary between faith and fear, devotion and destruction is always more fragile than it seems.
Thank you for stopping by at Crime Era Channel. We hope you enjoyed your time here. Ensure you like and subscribe to our channel so you get notified each time we uncover another hidden crime story. Don't forget to share so your friends and family so they too can know the hidden truth.